The child's voice cut through the smoke. My mother dead now. Skreek takes sister. Her words hung in the air, a plea that would test everything Maxime believed about survival. He carried only a knife and the memory of his captain's last words. Don't lose your humanity. Could he walk away from this child who stood alone in the ashes? The copper sky held no comfort, only the scent of strange pollen and decay. 12 months on Zaya had carved a single rule into Maxim's bones. Stay hidden, stay silent, stay alive. He moved through the forest's undergrowth like a shadow, his steps finding the silent places between roots and stone. His combat knife, earth-made and worn smooth at the grip, was the last relic of a dead world. It was his tool, his weapon, his only companion. His world had shrunk to a series of calculated risks. Every fork in the trail was a tactical decision. Every snapped twig in the distance was a potential death sentence. He avoided the faint paths worn by larger creatures. He never slept in the same place twice. His existence was a narrow calculation of calories spent versus calories gained, of risk versus reward. The memory of his captain was a ghost that walked beside him. Reeves's final transmission, crackling with static and pain, played on a loop in his mind. The mission's over, Lieutenant. They're all gone. Just don't lose your humanity out there. The words were an anchor, but also a weight, a standard he could never quite meet. The forest was never silent for long. The cries of the Skriak cut through the air, high-pitched and chittering. He'd learned their patterns. They hunted in packs, their blue skin a dappled blur in the twilight. He'd seen what their claws could do to a full-grown ursine. Their sound was a constant reminder that he was not at the top of this world's food chain. His diet was a grim routine of scavenged roots, bitter berries, and the occasional small, six-legged creature he could trap. Sustenance, not enjoyment. The closest thing to peace he found were the stolen moments of complete silence, when even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He would sit utterly still, listening to the absence of threat. Then he saw the smoke. It wasn't a cook fire. It was a thick black column staining the copper sky, a sign of chaos, not community. His instincts, honed by a year of survival, screamed at him to turn away, to melt back into the deep green safety of the trees. Whatever had happened there was over. Getting involved was a liability. It was a death wish, but a shape resolved itself amid the smoldering ruins of the small settlement. A single small figure, it stood motionless, a stark silhouette against the dying embers. It wasn't running. It wasn't hiding. It was just waiting. Every fiber of his training told him to retreat. This was a trap, an ambush, a lure. His hand tightened on the worn handle of his knife, his knuckles white. His muscles coiled, ready to spin and vanish back into the forest that had been his refuge and his prison. He took a step forward, then another. His approach was slow, cautious, each foot placed with deliberate care. His eyes scanned the tree line, the ruined huts, the sky. He expected an attack from any direction. His breath was shallow, his body a live wire of tension. He was a man walking directly against every survival instinct he possessed, drawn toward a silent question standing in the ashes. He stood 10 paces from the child, his knife held ready. The smoldering ruins gave off a low heat that warped the air. The girl's skin was the color of deep moss, smudged dark with soot and ash. She looked up at him, and her gaze was unsettling. There was no panic in it, no hysteria, just a flat, awful acceptance. My mother, she said. Her voice was clear and oddly calm, a stark contrast to the devastation around them. Dead now. She didn't gesture to a body. She didn't look away. She simply stated the fact as if reading a line from a report. Then she turned her head, her eyes scanning the dark tree line at the edge of the clearing. She raised a small, soot-stained hand and pointed into the deep green shadows. Skriak, take sister. Maxime's eyes followed her gesture into the oppressive quiet of the forest. His mind calculated the threat immediately. A pack predator, known for its speed and brutality. They didn't take prisoners. They took kills. The statement made no tactical sense, and anything that defied logic on Zaya was usually fatal. He studied her face again. Her eyes were dry. They held a clarity that was far older than her years, a terrible understanding of loss that had settled in without the messy release of tears. It was the look of someone who had already processed the worst and was now operating on the other side of grief. It was a soldier's look. Then his brain registered the other anomaly. She had spoken in perfect, unaccented English, the language of Earth. the language of his crashed ship, his dead crew. It was not the guttural clicks or melodic tones he sometimes heard echoing through the forests. This was his tongue, spoken by a green-skinned child standing in the ashes of her home. The disconnect was jarring, a piece of reality that had come unglued. "Please," she said, her voice dropping to little more than a whisper. It was the first crack in her composure, a faint tremor of need. Era, need help. The name hung between them, a person, a reason. Every instinct, every lesson learned through a year of brutal survival screamed at him. This was a trap. It had to be. Lures came in all forms. Predators were clever. They used weakness as bait. His grip on the knife's handle tightened until the worn grooves bit into his palm. His eyes darted across the clearing, searching the ruined huts for movement, for the glint of an ambush. He saw nothing. Just smoke and silence. He looked back at her. She stood alone. No hidden weapons. No sudden signals to unseen allies. Just a small, vulnerable form. Her shoulders slightly hunched against the weight of what she had seen, what she had lost. She was just a child. Then the ghost spoke. Captain Reeves's voice, crackling through static and pain, surfaced from the depths of his memory. "Don't lose your humanity." The words weren't a gentle plea anymore. They were an accusation. They were a challenge. They were the one piece of his old life that refused to let him fully embrace the savage simplicity of survival. He stood at a crossroads more defined than any forest trail. To his right was the known path. The safe path. Turn around, walk away, vanish back into the trees. Live another day by the code of the lone survivor. It was the smart choice. The rational choice. To his left stood a child who had just lost everything. A single impossible request. A deviation from the plan that had kept him breathing. His eyes moved from her small, determined face to the dark, waiting maw of the forest. He saw the danger. He calculated the odds. They were terrible. He made his choice. He broke the silence with a lie. "I'll help you find shelter," Maxime said, his voice rough from disuse. "Food, that's all." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. He wasn't offering a rescue mission. He was offering basic sustenance, the absolute baseline of survival. It was a boundary he drew in the dirt between them, a line meant to protect him. He could rationalize providing food and temporary safety. He could not rationalize a quest into Skriak territory for a girl who was likely already dead. This lie was a shield against the weight of her hope, a way to keep the vast, dangerous need of this world from swallowing him whole. She looked at him, her green-skinned face still smudged with soot, and simply nodded. There was no hesitation, no questioning his limited offer. Her trust was immediate and absolute, a terrifyingly fragile thing he now held in his hands. "Nima," she said, tapping her chest lightly. A name he gave his in return, the formalities of a doomed partnership. She gestured to her own skin, then to the vibrant green leaves around them. "My people, Vidian." She said the word with a soft reverence. It means green ones in the old tongue. It was the first piece of a culture he had only witnessed from a distance, now offered freely. As they moved away from the ruins, keeping to the deeper shadows, she spoke in fragments. Her English, she explained, came from others. "Big ships came from the sky, seasons ago." She held her hands wide to illustrate their size. "They looked like you, spoke your words. Some of them stayed for a time, learned the rhythms of the land, traded trinkets for information. They shared their language. Then one season they were simply gone. They left as they had arrived, vanishing back into the copper sky. Her people were left with a few new words in the empty space where the visitors had been. Her story explained her fluency, but it also painted a picture of abandonment, a pattern Maxime understood all too well. Their journey became a slow, cautious exchange of skills. His earthbound pragmatism, all hard edges and immediate threats, met her deep indigenous knowledge of the living world. He saw a plant as potential cover. She saw it as a source of water or a potent medicine. He heard a sound and identified a predator. She heard the same sound and identified its direction and distance. It was a silent negotiation of two different ways of seeing. They stopped at a small hidden stream. He used his knife to cut a straight, sturdy sapling, fashioning a crude but effective spear. Its point fire-hardened to a sharp tip. She watched, then gathered flexible vines for cordage. Together they assembled a small hunter's kit. The spear, a simple bow made from a curved branch, a few arrows fletched with large leaves. and water bladders made from cleaned animal skins she produced from a hidden cache near the stream. The training began. He showed her how to move without snapping twigs, how to keep her silhouette broken against the tree line, how to control her breathing to remain silent. He was teaching her the art of the ghost, the only thing he had left to give. In return, she pointed out plants whose tubers could be eaten raw, others whose leaves made a poultice for wounds. She showed him paths that were invisible to his eyes, game trails that wound through seemingly impenetrable thickets, and safe places to cross rocky scree where footing was treacherous. An alliance formed in those quiet hours. It was not built on promises or grand declarations. It was built on the practical, immediate need to survive the next hour, the next mile. It was a fragile thing, this partnership between a solitary soldier and a grieving child. There were no words of comfort, no shared mourning. There was only the shared work of moving forward, of preparing for what was to come. They were two isolated figures bound together not by choice, but by circumstance, their fates now inextricably linked by a simple, unspoken agreement to face the forest together. The forest tested them with every step. The ground was a treacherous mix of loose shale and grasping roots. Each rustle in the canopy could be a harmless glider monkey, or the first sign of a hunting pack. Maxim's senses were wired tight. His focus narrowed to a 10-meter radius of potential threats. Nima moved behind him, a small, silent shadow trying to mimic his exact footfalls. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, a faint, sour musk that made the hair on his arms stand up. They were getting closer to Skriak territory. The signs were everywhere. Deep claw marks on tree bark, scattered bones picked clean, and that smell. It was the smell of a predator's den. A branch snapped to their left. Not a natural fall. A weight had disturbed it. Maxim froze, his hand snapping up in a closed fist. Nima halted instantly, melting into the cover of a large fern. He slowly turned his head, his eyes scanning the dappled shadows. For a long moment there was nothing. Then a patch of shadow detached itself from a broad tree trunk. It was a Skriak sentry, larger than any he'd seen before. Its blue skin was a perfect camouflage in the shifting forest light, mottled with patterns that broke up its form. It hadn't seen them yet. It was sniffing the air, its long neck craning, its rows of needle teeth clicking softly. It was between them and the only safe path forward. Maxim's mind ran the calculations in a cold, instant flash. They couldn't go around. They couldn't wait it out. It knew something was close. A fight was inevitable, and it had to be decisive. Silence was the only weapon they had. He gave Nima a look, a single shake of his head that meant, stay hidden, stay silent. Then he moved. He didn't run, he flowed. He used the cover of a fallen log, then a thick cluster of purple-barked saplings. His footfalls made no sound. He was a predator himself now, all controlled intent and lethal focus. The Skriak's head turned, its large black eyes searching. It was a second too late, his knife was in his hand. It wasn't a dramatic swing or a frenzied attack. It was a single precise motion. He came up from its blind side, his left arm hooking around its neck to pin it, his right hand driving the blade deep into the base of its throat, angling upward. The creature spasmed, a choked gurgle escaping its maw. Its claws scrabbled against his leg, tearing through his worn trousers and drawing a sharp line of fire across his calf. He held on, putting his full weight into the hold until the struggle ceased. The whole thing lasted less than 5 seconds. The forest was silent again. He lowered the body to the ground, his breath coming in quiet, controlled pulls. A warm trickle of blood ran down his leg from the shallow gash. He ignored it. The immediate task was disposal. He grabbed the creature by its thick hind legs and dragged its considerable weight into a dense thicket of thorny undergrowth, covering it with loose leaves and debris. It wouldn't hide the smell for long, but it would buy them time. He turned back to find Nima standing where he'd left her. She hadn't moved. Her green eyes were wide, fixed on the spot where the Skriak had fallen. There was no fear in her look. It was something closer to awe. She looked from the disturbed undergrowth back to him, her gaze taking in the blood on his leg, the calm efficiency of his movements. Her small face was solemn. "You fight like a ghost," she said. Her voice was a hushed whisper, as if speaking too loud might break the spell. The name settled over him. It wasn't a title he would have chosen. It was an observation, a statement of fact from a child who had just witnessed a kind of violence that was both terrifying and necessary. He was no longer just Maxim, the lone survivor. He was no longer just a hazard to be avoided. In her eyes, he had become something else. A ghost, a myth made real in blood and shadow, a sliver of hope in a world that offered very little. The name stuck. It was a reputation born in that moment, and it carried a weight he could feel. They pressed on, the terrain beginning to slope upward toward the distant, jagged line of mountains. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were a throbbing pain in his leg and a new name whispered in the quiet. Every silent step toward the mountains, toward the sister taken, felt heavier than the last. The mission had solidified from a vague promise into a tangible, dangerous path. He was a ghost walking toward a lair of monsters, and a child was placing her entire world in his blood-stained hands. The trail ended at a high plateau. The ground underfoot was rocky and barren, littered with strange formations. They were crude totems, stacks of flat stones carefully balanced one upon another. Some stood knee-high, others reached his waist. They formed a silent, ragged circle around the area, like broken teeth against the sky. They felt less like art and more like markers, warnings. The air here was different. It carried the familiar scent of wood smoke, but underneath it was something else, a sour, musky odor, thick and organic. It was the smell of a predator's den, amplified 100-fold. It was the smell of something alive and something that had died. Nima stopped walking. Her small body was rigid. She pointed a trembling finger toward the base of the cliff face that rose from the plateau. There, a dark opening yawned. It was a cavern mouth, wide and irregular, like a wound in the mountain's side. A faint mist seemed to breathe from it, a cold exhalation that carried that same sour stench. It was a place that felt utterly wrong. It swallowed sound and light. Maxim's instincts, honed by a lifetime of assessing threats, screamed at him to retreat. This was a heart of darkness. This was where the monsters lived. They left the open sky behind. The world narrowed to a tunnel of rock and shadow. They crept inside, their footsteps echoing faintly in the vast space. The only light came from further within, a flickering, uneven orange glow that cast long, dancing shadows. His eyes strained to adjust. The cavern was enormous, its ceiling lost in darkness. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet stone and that pervasive foul musk. The torchlight came from large fire pits dug into the cavern floor, their flames licking hungrily at the air. The scene they illuminated was not one of primitive ritual. It was one of industry, of systematic confinement. Then he saw them. Dozens of them. Cages fashioned from lashed-together timber and sharpened stakes lined the cavern walls. Inside them were people, Vidians, men and women with green skin dulled by grime and exhaustion. They sat or stood in silent clusters, their eyes hollow. They were captives, livestock. He scanned the faces, his gut tightening. Then he saw her. A smaller figure huddled in a corner of one cage, knees drawn to her chest. She had Nima's eyes, her same small frame, Era. She was alive. She stared blankly at the firelight, her expression one of numb terror. The fire pits themselves were the source of the terrible light. They weren't burning simple wood. Thick, viscous liquid bubbled in crude clay containers set near the flames, feeding them. This was the fire water Nima had mentioned. It burned with the intense, unnatural heat, casting a harsh, glaring light that hurt the eyes. It was the kind of light used not for warmth or comfort, but for work, for control. And moving among the cages and the fire pits were the workers, the guards, Skreek. They moved with a purpose he hadn't seen before. This wasn't a hunting pack on the prowl. This was a garrison overseeing its holdings. Some stood watch, their black eyes scanning the captives. Others tended the fire pits, using long poles to adjust the containers of burning liquid. They were not just random predators. They were jailers. They had built this place. They were farming. He felt a small, cold hand slip into his. Nima's grip was iron tight, her small fingers clutching his with a desperate strength. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on her sister in the cage, her face a mask of anguish and fury. He could feel the fine tremor running through her arm. In that moment, the last of his calculated reservations evaporated. This was no longer a choice between safe and unsafe, between smart and foolish. The cool calculus of survival had no equation for this. The sight of caged children, the smell of fear and fire, the sheer industrialized horror of it rewired something fundamental in him. The rescue was no longer a risky side mission. It was an absolute duty. It was the only thing left in the world that made any sense at all. They crouched behind a jagged outcrop of rock, the cold stone biting through their clothes. The space was just large enough to hide them from the view of the nearest Skreek guard. The stink of the fire pits filled their lungs. The stakes were no longer a concept. They were the sight of Ira huddled in her cage, the listless postures of the other captives, the casual cruelty of the blue-skinned overseers. Waiting meant watching this continue. Action meant almost certain death. There was no good move on the board. Nima spoke first. Her voice was so low Maxim had to lean in to hear it, a tiny whisper against the cavern's vast, breathing silence. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the guard patrols, calculating their rhythm. She explained it with a chilling, simple clarity. The Skriak had a weakness. Their eyes, so good in the forest's dappled shadows, were vulnerable. They hated bright, sudden light. The intense glare of the fire pits, fueled by the stolen firewater, was why they kept the area so well lit. It was a control measure, but it was also their own sensory limitation. She pointed with her chin toward a pile of discarded brittle leaves near one of the pits. "Zuka leaves," she whispered. They were dry and papery. She'd seen them used in her village for quick, hot fires to cauterize a wound or signal over long distances. They burned fast and hot. Her plan took shape in a few spare sentences. She would take a small pouch of the fire water and a handful of the Zuka leaves. She would slip along the far wall, using the deep shadows cast by the cages. She would get as far from the main group of prisoners as possible. Then she would create the distraction. She would douse the leaves and ignite them. It would create a sudden, brilliant flare of light and heat at the cavern's far end. The shock and sensory overload would disorient the Skriak. Their instinct would be to turn toward the new, overwhelming stimulus, to investigate the threat. It would pull their attention away from the cages. That was the signal. The moment the light flashed, Maxim would move. His job was not to fight every guard. His job was to break open the cages. He would use his knife on the leather bindings, his strength on the wooden bars. The freed Vidians, seeing their chance, would rush out. They would grab anything they could use as a weapon. Rocks, sharpened bones, the very bars of their cages. They would create a second, chaotic front. The goal was not a pitched battle. It was a breakout. A stampede for the exit. It was a gambit only a child would propose. It was brilliant in its simplicity, its direct targeting of the enemy's weakness, and it was utterly reckless. It relied on perfect timing. It assumed the Vidians, weakened and terrified, would have the will to fight. It left a 7-year-old girl alone in the dark with a pouch of volatile liquid, tasked with drawing the attention of a pack of predators directly onto herself. Maxim's earth-trained mind instantly mapped the countless points of failure. The fire could fail to ignite. She could be seen on her approach. The Vidians could freeze. The Skriak could recover from the disorientation faster than expected. There were 100 ways for them all to die screaming in this hole in the mountain. From the shadows near them, an older Vidian male met Maxim's eyes. His green skin was lined with age and hardship, but his gaze was sharp and clear. He had been listening. He gave a slow, grave nod. He understood the plan. He understood the cost. He looked from Maxim to Nima, then back to the cages holding his people. His voice was a low rumble, the English words heavy and broken but unmistakable in their meaning. "Together," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. They would do this together or they would die together. There was no other option. Maxim looked from the elder's resolute face to Nima's small, determined one. He looked at the impossible geometry of the cavern, the number of enemies, the sheer scale of the risk. His mind, so good at finding the flaw, the escape route, the fallback position, found nothing. There was no alternative in this darkness. No clever plan B. There was only this mad child's gamble. It was all they had. He gave a single sharp nod. The plan was set. The die was cast. A sharp fizzing sound cut through the cavern's rumble. Then a shower of white-hot sparks erupted from the far wall, a brilliant flare against the deep gloom. Nima's signal. It was time. Maxim was already moving, pushing off from the rock that had hidden them. He didn't run. He flowed through the chaos, a ghost using the confusion as his cover. The initial sparks were nothing compared to what came next. The firewater found its catalyst. A soft whoomp echoed through the cavern, a sound of pressure and ignition. Then a wall of raw flame roared upward, climbing the rock face, a sudden and violent sun that lit the entire cavern in a harsh, garish light. The heat hit him like a physical blow, the air shimmering with distortion. The reaction was instantaneous. The Skriak guards closest to the blast recoiled, their high-pitched shrieks slicing through the air. They clawed at their oversized black eyes, blinded and disoriented by the sudden overwhelming intensity. The carefully maintained order of their nest shattered. Some turned and rushed toward the new threat, drawn by the instinct to confront it. Others scrambled backward, their movements erratic and panicked. The confinement of the cave turned their confusion into a trap, the heat and toxic smoke from the burning liquid building fast, choking the air. Maxim didn't watch the spectacle. He had his objective. He reached the first cage, his knife already working at the thick leather cords binding the wooden bars. The fibers parted under the sharp edge. A Vidian man burst out first, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and sudden furious hope. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy fist-sized stone from the cavern floor. Others followed his lead, pouring from the broken cage, snatching up broken tools, sharp fragments of bone, anything that could be used as a weapon. They were weak, they were scared, but they were no longer passive. They were a storm waiting to break. The man who had first emerged locked eyes with Maxim. He was older, his green skin creased with lines of hardship, but his eyes held a fierce, burning light. "Tarek," he grunted, hefting his rock. He didn't need to say more. He fell in beside Maxim, a temporary ally forged in the heart of the fire. Together, they moved down the line of cages, Maxim cutting bonds, Tarek using his strength and his rock to prise bars apart, the freed Vidians swelling their numbers. The cavern was a nightmarish tableau of fire and shadow, the disoriented Skriek cries echoing off the stone, creating a symphony of chaos. They found her in the third cage. Era was huddled in the farthest corner, knees drawn tight to her chest, her small body trembling violently. She wasn't crying. She was in a state of pure, silent shock, her eyes seeing nothing. Maxim sliced through the last cord. Tarek reached in, his large hands surprisingly gentle, and pulled the small girl out. He held her against his chest, her face buried in his shoulder, a shield of flesh and bone. From across the cavern a different cry sounded. Not a Skriek's shriek of pain, but a child's fierce shout of defiance. Nima. A guard, recovering its senses, had cornered her against a rock wall near the dying flames of her distraction. She held a smoldering branch like a spear, jabbing it at the creature's face, forcing it to flinch back from the heat and light. She was protecting her sister's retreat, a tiny, stubborn roadblock in the path of a monster. The cave was now a maze of fire, fear, and close-quarters fighting. The initial advantage of surprise was fading. The Skriek were regrouping, their panic solidifying into anger. They began to form a loose, snarling circle, cutting off the clearest path to the exit. The rescue was no longer a plan. It was a brutal, visceral dance of survival. It was a desperate shoving match in a burning, smoke-filled room, where every second brought them closer to being overwhelmed. They had the people. Now they had to get them out. The cavern's air grew thick with the reek of burned fuel and scorched rock. The initial burst of freedom was collapsing into a tightening noose of blue-skinned bodies. The main entrance was a solid wall of snarling Skriek, their claws extended, their black eyes reflecting the dying flames. They were regrouping, cutting off the escape. Maxim scanned the cavern, his mind racing for an exit that wasn't there. Then a Vidian woman gestured frantically toward the back of the cave, to a section of wall that was slick and dark. A low rushing sound came from there. It wasn't a way out they had planned for. It was a desperate alternative. A narrow crack in the rock seeped water, a fast-flowing stream disappearing into a black opening just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was a water passage. It was their only option. They ran for it, a ragged group of survivors clustering around the children. Maxim went last, his knife held ready to cover the retreat. He could hear the scrape of claws on stone behind them, too close. The Skriek had seen their move and were giving chase, their bodies low to the ground, their cries of fury echoing in the confined space. The passage was tight, the walls pressing in, the water shockingly cold as it soaked through their clothes and stole the breath from their lungs. It was a blind plunge into the unknown, a gamble that this underwater tunnel didn't just dead-end in a rock wall. They spilled out onto a slick, rocky bank inside a larger, subterranean river channel. The current was strong and fast, pulling at their legs. They were gasping, disoriented, the roar of the water filling their ears. The light from the cavern was gone, replaced by a profound, almost tangible darkness. But they weren't alone. The scraping, splashing sounds of pursuit were right behind them. A Skriek, larger than the others, surfaced from the tunnel they had just exited. It shook its head, water flying from its blue hide, and focused its black eyes on them. It began to wade through the rushing water toward the bank, its intent clear. Tarek stopped. The older Vidian fighter who had stood with Maxime in the cages turned at the river's edge. He wasn't looking at the approaching predator. His eyes found Maxime's in the gloom. They held no fear, no hesitation. There was only a grim, absolute resolve. He gave a single sharp nod. It was a message. An understanding. Then he spoke a single word, his voice cutting through the water's roar. Go. He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and dove, but he didn't dive into the deeper water to swim across. He dove back toward the tunnel mouth, a powerful stroke taking him directly into the path of the pursuing Skriak. His movement was a sudden, deliberate distraction. The creature's head snapped toward him, drawn by the splash and the movement. It changed course, its predatory instinct locking onto the closer, more immediate target. It submerged after him. Maxime saw it happen. He took a sharp breath to shout, to call him back, but the word died in his throat. No. It was a silent protest that changed nothing. The dark, fast water swallowed them both. There was a violent churning on the surface for a few seconds. A brief, brutal struggle lost in the roar of the river. Then the current took them, pulling the fight downstream into the absolute blackness. The sacrifice was complete. It was a transaction as old as time, a life for lives, a stranger's death to buy their freedom. The remaining group stood frozen for a heartbeat on the bank, the reality of it settling over them. Then they moved. They half-waded, half-swam across the powerful current, helping each other, grabbing onto rocks to keep from being swept away. They scrambled up the far bank on the other side, their bodies shaking with cold and adrenaline, their lungs burning as they gasped for air. They were out. They were free of the mountain. The open night sky was above them, dotted with unfamiliar constellations. Maxime hauled himself onto the bank, the cold water streaming from his clothes. He looked back at the black water, at the place where Tarek had vanished. The man was gone, a stranger whose name he'd only learned an hour before, a man who had died without a second thought so that children he didn't know could live. It was a weight that settled in Maxime's chest, heavy and permanent. He had spent a year learning the rules of survival on Zaya, rules of isolation and self-preservation. In one act, a green-skinned fighter from a different star had rewritten them all. Courage, he learned in that moment, did not always announce itself with a speech or a flag. Sometimes it wore a stranger's face. Sometimes it was a single word spoken in the dark before a final, selfless dive. It was a debt that could never be repaid, only carried. They huddled on the riverbank, shivering and exhausted. The adrenaline of the escape had faded, leaving them with the cold reality of the night and their losses. The river roared beside them, a constant reminder of the sacrifice that had bought their freedom. They were a ragged group, the rescued Vidians from the mountain and the two children clinging to Maxime's side. They had no supplies, no plan. They were exposed. Then soft footfalls approached from the tree line, not the heavy, scraping steps of Skriak. These were quiet, deliberate. A group of figures emerged from the shadows. They were Vidians, but different from the ones he'd seen in the cages. Their green skin was clean, their posture straight. They moved with a quiet confidence that spoke of belonging to this land, not just surviving on it. They carried simple spears and woven bags, but no advanced gear. Their leader stepped forward. He was an older male, his bearing calm and certain. This was Sovereign. He didn't speak at first. His eyes scanned the group, taking in their condition, their wounds, the two human children with them. His gaze was assessing but not hostile. It held a deep, patient authority. A woman moved from behind him. She carried a small pouch made of soft leather. This was LRA, a healer. She went to the injured first, her movements efficient and practiced. She knelt beside Maxim. His leg where the Skriak claw had caught him was still bleeding, the gash angry and deep. She didn't flinch. She opened her pouch, revealing dried leaves and a paste in a small clay pot. She cleaned the wound with water from a skin, then applied the paste with deft fingers. It cooled the fire of the cut instantly. She bound it with clean strips of cloth. Her work was quick, effective, and utterly silent. It was medicine that came from the forest, not a medkit. Sovereign finally spoke. His voice was low, his words measured. He explained their way, not with grand speeches, but with simple statements. His people, the southern tribe, lived by a single rule: harmony with Zaya's ecosystem. They took only what they needed from the land. They gave back what they could, They had deliberately abandoned the advanced technologies that other humans had brought. This was not a primitive choice. It was a deliberate philosophy, a way to exist without dominance, without creating the imbalances that drew the attention of larger predators or poisoned the water. It was a complex understanding of balance. This philosophy was not pacifism. They understood the Skriak. They knew their patterns, their territories, their nature. They saw them not as monsters to be eradicated, but as predators acting within a wider web of life, a web that included the Vidians and the humans who had come to their world. They avoided conflict not out of weakness, but out of a nuanced strategy for long-term survival. They respected the Skriak's power and gave them a wide berth, knowing that a direct fight was often a lose-lose scenario for both sides. This perspective was a direct counterpoint to Maxim's earthborn pragmatism, which saw threats as problems to be eliminated, obstacles to be overcome. Sovereign looked at Maxim, then at Nima and Ira, who had not left his side. He saw the bond that had formed. He saw the protector the children had chosen. His offer was simple: shelter, protection, a place among them. It was not a temporary haven. It was an invitation to belong. For a man who had spent a year alone, whose entire world had been reduced to a knife and the next meal, the offer was strangely disorienting. It was a weight, a responsibility, but it was also a warmth he had forgotten existed. The hard shell of the loner, the ghost who walked alone, felt the first faint, uneasy tug of something new. It was the feeling of a door opening onto a room he thought had been sealed shut forever. It was the first whisper of belonging. The shrill, mechanical beep from his discarded pack was a sound from another life. The emergency beacon. He'd forgotten it was even there. A dead relic from a crashed shuttle. Its power cell must have reactivated, sending its automated SOS up through the copper sky to satellites that no longer watched this sector. It was a ghost reaching out from his past, and it had been answered. The sound was a violation of the forest's natural chorus. 3 days ahead of schedule, the sky tore open. A shuttle descended on pillars of fire, its engines a deafening roar that silenced the birds and sent small creatures scattering. The ship was a sleek, gunmetal gray wedge, marked with the sharp, angular insignia of the Earth Alliance. It was a piece of his old world, landing like a hammer in the middle of his new one. The hatch hissed open. A woman in a crisp, dark blue flight suit stepped down the ramp. Her movements were precise, economical. Captain Alexa Rivera, her eyes sharp and assessing, scanned the clearing, the Vidians who had gathered at the edge of the trees and finally landed on him. She took him in. Not the lieutenant she was sent to find, but a man in worn, Vidian-made leathers, his skin tanned and scarred, his hair too long. His combat knife was still on his belt, but it looked like a tool here, not a weapon. Her gaze was a physical thing, cool and professional. "We picked up your emergency beacon," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the wonder or relief a rescue might imply. It was a statement of fact. Her eyes did a second, slower pass over him. They noted the cut on his leg, neatly bound with plant fiber bandages. They took in the simple clothes, the lack of any standard-issue gear. They flickered to the 2 green-skinned children who had instinctively moved to stand close to him, their small hands finding the fabric of his trousers. Nima and Era didn't speak. They just looked at the newcomer with a wary, protective stillness. Captain Rivera's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd seen this before in reports. "You've gone native," she noted. The term was clinical. A professional assessment from a military field manual. It wasn't an accusation of betrayal. It was a diagnosis of compromised operational effectiveness, a security risk. Her demands were immediate and left no room for debate. Return was non-negotiable, medical care for his injuries, a full psychological and physical debriefing, extraction from a hostile environment, home. She said the word, but it landed with a hollow thud. Home was a planet of steel and glass, of debriefing rooms and casualty reports. Home was a bunk on a ship surrounded by people who followed orders and saw the universe through a tactical lens. The word no longer fit. It was a shirt he'd outgrown. It was a complicated, tangled question without a clear answer. He didn't have to look down. He could feel them there. Nima's grip on his leg tightened. Era pressed her face against his side. Their presence was a silent, undeniable claim. They were not part of the mission parameters. They were not an asset to be logged or a cultural curiosity to be studied. They were his. They were the reason his heart was still beating. His silence stretched. Captain Rivera watched him, her posture stiff. She saw the conflict. She saw the attachment. Protocol dictated immediate extraction. The situation on the ground dictated otherwise. A standoff settled over the clearing. The hum of the shuttle's idling engines was the only sound. The rescue was no longer a simple retrieval. It was a negotiation. Captain Rivera, bound by her duty and her assessment of a compromised asset. Maxime, bound by a debt and a bond that ran deeper than any oath he'd ever sworn. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just stood his ground. She finally gave a tight, reluctant nod. They would not leave immediately. She would grant a concession. A 3-day observation period. She would call it that in her log. But everyone present knew what it really was. It was a battle for his future, and it had just begun. The shuttle's engines cycled down, their roar fading into an ominous quiet. The morning air on the plateau was thin and cold. The copper sun had just broken the horizon, painting the stones in long, warm shadows. Nima and Era led him there. They walked without speaking, their small, serious faces turned toward the high place. A circle of standing stones rose from the flat rock. The stones were old, their surfaces worn smooth by wind and time. They were arranged with a deliberate geometry that felt both ancient and immediate. This was not a monument. It was a tool, a place for decision. They stopped at the edge of the circle. Era's small, cool hand found his. She looked up at him, her green eyes holding that same eerie clarity he'd seen in the ashes. 2 worlds, she said. Her voice was soft but clear in the quiet dawn. Nima stood on his other side. 2 paths, she added. Then she placed her hand over where his and Era's were joined. But 1 heart. The words were simple. They held no poetry, no grand philosophy. They were a statement of the problem, and a startlingly simple proposal for its solution. The dilemma he'd been wrestling with, Earth or Zaya, safety or belonging, his past or his present, was reframed. It was not a choice between 2 opposites. It was an acknowledgement of 2 truths that now existed inside him. Sovereign and a few other elders stood at a respectful distance. They did not approach. They did not speak. Their presence was a watchful silence, an observance of a ritual that was clearly important to their people. This was their way. This circle was where young Vidians came to find their life path. It was a guide, not a command. They were offering him their tradition, not imposing it. They were inviting him to use it for his own purpose. An elder finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that carried across the stone. See both paths clearly. The instruction was not to choose one. It was to see them, to understand the weight and value of each, to honor both, the safety and technology of Earth, the world that had made him, the raw immediate belonging of the Vidians, the people who had remade him. The circle did not demand he deny one for the other. It offered a way to hold both in balance, to let his identity stretch to encompass the 2 stars he now called home. He looked from the silent elders back to the circle of stones. He thought of Captain Rivera waiting by her shuttle, her offer of a return to a clean, ordered existence. He thought of the sterile corridors of a starship, the familiar weight of a standard-issue rifle. It was a known quantity, a life of defined parameters and clear commands. Then he looked down at the 2 small hands holding his. He felt the ghost of Tarek's sacrifice, a debt that could only be paid by staying. He felt the rough texture of his Vidian-made clothes, the solid reality of the knife on his belt that was now a tool for protection, not just survival. The vision circle asked him to hold both images in his mind at once, not to compare them but to accept that they were both true, that he contained both the soldier and the guardian, the Earthman and the ghost of the green forests. His identity, which for so long had been a singular hardened point, a survivor, now felt like it was stretching, expanding to fit a new and more complex shape. It was a terrifying feeling. It was also the first moment of real peace he'd felt since the crash. The circle didn't give him an answer. It gave him a new way to see the question. The path forward was not a fork in the road. It was a wider road altogether. The sisters stood before him on the sun-warmed stone. The dawn light made their green skins seem to glow. Their faces, so often marked by a child's curiosity or a survivor's grim focus, were now set with a startling seriousness. Their large eyes held his, and there was no room for argument in them. "We family now," Nima said. Era gave a firm nod, her small chin jutting out. The words were not a question. They were not a hope or a wish. They were a declaration of fact, simple and final, as unchangeable as the mountains around them. It was a statement that bypassed all debate, all negotiation. It just was. In their world, forged in loss and sealed in fire, the bond had been made. The paperwork was written in shared survival, and it required no signature. They did not stand alone. Sovereign and the other elders of the southern tribe watched from a short distance. Their silence was not passive. It was an affirmation. When Nima spoke, they gave a single unified nod. Their offer, which had once been shelter, was now something more permanent. A future, a place within the intricate web of their community. They were not just offering him a hut. They were offering him a role, a responsibility, a name that was more than just a word. They were recognizing the new reality the children had named. The identity he had carried for a year, Maxim the ghost, the shadow, the lone survivor, slipped from his shoulders like an old coat. It was replaced by a new weight, a new shape. He was Maxim the protector, the patriarch, the one they looked to. He felt the outline of it, unfamiliar and heavy. It was a title built not on rank or appointment, but on trust earned in the dark and sealed with a child's hand in his. This new truth sat beside his old life like two mismatched pieces of machinery. His Earth loyalties, his training, his duty to the Alliance, they were still there, real and tangible. But they now felt like artifacts in a museum, things to be respected and remembered but no longer used in daily life. They chafed against the raw, immediate reality of this declaration of family. One was a set of rules and regulations. The other was a fact written in blood and shared silence. Across the plateau, the sound of activity continued. Captain Rivera's crew moved with practiced efficiency around their shuttle. They checked systems, ran diagnostics, packed away gear not immediately needed. Their movements were a countdown. Their timeline was short, measured in hours now, not days. The reality of extraction was a ship waiting to ignite its engines and tear a hole back through the sky to a world of steel and order. The choice he had been wrestling with was still technically his to make. He could walk to that shuttle. He could give his report. He could return to the life he knew. But the weight of that choice had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer a balanced scale with equal measures of pros and cons. The side holding the two small, green-skinned girls and their simple, devastating statement had grown immeasurably heavier. It was no longer about what he wanted. It was about what he was. The word home had meant a specific set of coordinates. A planet, a city, a barracks. Now standing on an alien plateau, the definition reformed itself in his mind. Home was no longer a place on a star chart. It was the pressure of a small hand in his. It was the serious set of a child's face looking up at him with absolute trust. It was the quiet nod of an elder acknowledging a bond he had not chosen, but could not deny. Home was a people. For over a year, his entire existence had been predicated on having nothing to lose. That was the freedom of the ghost. That was the simplicity of survival. Now looking down at the two faces that had declared themselves his family, he understood the terrifying, wonderful truth. The lone survivor was gone. In his place stood a man who had, against all his own rules, found something. And finding something to care for, to protect, to lose was the most dangerous and the most human thing a man could do. The shuttle sat on the plateau, a stark gray artifact from a world of steel and order. It hummed with a low, impatient energy, its hatch still open like an invitation. Maxime stood between that open door and the green edge of the forest where the tribe waited. He was a man divided, his body a fault line between two realities. One step toward the ship was a return to clear lines of command, medical bays, and the sterile safety of a known life. One step toward the trees was a plunge into a world of uncertainty, of deep connection, of responsibility that had no manual. His mind went back to the cold rush of the underground river. He saw Tarek's face in that last second, the grim resolve, the single nod. The man had given his life for people he did not know. It was a debt, not a debt you could repay with words or a report filed on some distant station. It was a debt that could only be honored by staying, by continuing the work, by proving that the sacrifice had meant something. To walk away now would make that final dive into the dark water meaningless. He looked down. Nima's small hand was in his. He could feel the faint pressure of her grip, the absolute trust in that simple contact. She had found him in the ashes and given him a purpose he hadn't asked for. She had declared him family with a child's unshakable certainty. To betray that trust, to get on that shuttle and watch her face as it lifted off, was an act of cowardice he could not commit. Her need was a stronger force than any order from Captain Rivera. Captain Reeves's final words surfaced in his memory, the static-filled transmission from a dying man. Don't lose your humanity. For a year he had interpreted that as a warning, a command to not become a monster, to not sink to the level of the predators that hunted him. He understood it differently now. Humanity wasn't just about refraining from brutality. It wasn't a state of being you protected. It was a thing you built. It was connection. It was the hand of a child in yours. It was the shared silence of people who have faced death together. Reeves hadn't been telling him to hold on to something. He'd been telling him to find it. The Vidian way was a constant challenge to his every assumption. Their philosophy of harmony, of taking only what was needed, of seeing themselves as a single thread in a vast web, it was the opposite of his earth-born pragmatism. His training was to assess, control, and dominate his environment. Theirs was to understand, adapt, and exist within it. It was a more complex, more difficult path. But watching them, living with them for even a short time, he saw its strength. Survival wasn't just a matter of staying alive by any means necessary. It was about living for something beyond your own heartbeat. It was about ensuring a future for others. His eyes moved from the hard, angular lines of the Alliance shuttle to the soft, living line of the forest. He saw Sovereign standing with the elders, their patience a silent offer. He saw LRA, the healer, her hands that had so calmly treated his wound. He saw the two small green-skinned girls who had rewired his entire existence. The choice was no longer about safety. It was not a calculation of risk and reward. It was a question of fidelity. Who was he faithful to? The ghost of his old life or the living, breathing reality of his new one? The ghost would not be returning to Earth, not today. Not on that shuttle. The lone survivor who had hidden in the trees for a year was gone. That man had died in the mountain cavern, replaced by something else. His mission had changed. It was no longer about enduring. It was about protecting. His heart had changed. It was no longer a closed fist, but an open hand. He took a slow breath, the air tasting of alien pollen and cool stone. The resolve settled in him, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a simple, solid fact. He turned his back on the ship. Captain Alexa Rivera watched the man, not the soldier. Her training provided a clear, cold assessment. Lieutenant Maxim Vulov was compromised. The mission parameters had included recovering a stranded asset. They had not included negotiating with an asset who had clearly integrated with the indigenous population. Her duty was clear-cut. Retrieve the individual, secure a full debrief, file a comprehensive report on the situation and the potential security risks. The protocol was a known quantity, a series of checkboxes on a standard operations form. Her primary concern was the successful extraction of the asset and the mitigation of any intelligence hazards his prolonged exposure might have created. She noted the signs of deep integration with a clinical eye. The Gone Native syndrome was a documented phenomenon in long-term isolation scenarios. It represented a significant danger to operational security. An integrated asset could be turned. They could develop divided loyalties. They could compromise mission integrity through leaked information or faulty judgment calls based on local allegiances. Her initial assessment was purely professional, focused on the potential threats to her crew, her ship, and the broader Earth Alliance interests in the sector. This was a textbook risk scenario, but then her eyes moved to the children, the two green-skinned girls who stood so close to him, their small hands gripping his makeshift clothing. She saw the way they looked at him. It wasn't just dependence. It was a deep, unshakable trust. They saw him as their protector, their safe harbor. This was not a variable covered in her training manuals. There was no protocol for this. No checklist item for evaluating the bond between a stranded soldier and the local children who had clearly claimed him. The clear, easy answer of forced extraction suddenly had jagged, complicated edges. Her training offered no guidance for the human element staring her in the face. This was the unknown, the unquantifiable variable that could derail even the most straightforward retrieval op. She made a command decision that bent the rules. She gave him 3 days. She framed it as a necessary observation period to assess his physical and mental state more thoroughly before the stress of spaceflight. It was a concession not to him, but to the sheer strangeness of the situation. She needed to understand what she was really dealing with. Her official logs and reports would classify this delay as extended field observation. The term was dry and professional. It would satisfy command. But she knew it was more than that. It was a stalling tactic. A quiet admission that the situation demanded more time than the book allowed. It was a space to breathe, to think, to see if there was another path besides the rigid one laid out by procedure. And even she, a career officer trained to remain detached, felt the subtle pull of this place. It was in the quiet dignity of the green-skinned elders who watched her without fear. It was in the raw, untamed beauty of the copper sky and the deep living forest. It was a quiet strength that existed entirely outside the metal and glass world she knew. The air itself felt different. It held a weight, a presence that was both alien and profoundly calming. This was not a feeling she could log or report. The clean, sharp line between her professional duty and her personal perception began to blur. The asset was becoming a man again. The indigenous population were becoming people, with families and a culture she did not understand. The mission was becoming a moral dilemma. She stood by her shuttle, a bastion of Earth technology, and felt the first faint cracks in her absolute certainty. The right thing and the by-the-book thing were no longer the same. She had given him 3 days. In truth, she had given herself 3 days to find a way to bridge the impossible gap between her orders and the reality on the ground. The bond between them settled into a rhythm deeper than language. It grew in the quiet spaces between words and the small practical actions that built a shared life. They could sit together for an hour and say nothing, each watching a different sector of the forest, their silence a conversation of its own. He would feel a small tap on his shoulder and turn to find Nima offering him a piece of fruit she had foraged. He would break a piece of dried meat in half and hand a portion to Era without her asking. These were not grand gestures. They were the simple mechanics of trust, the unspoken agreement that they would watch each other's backs. They began to exchange more than just food and guard duty. He cleared a patch of dirt and used a stick to teach them a simple game from his childhood, a grid of lines and stones. They watched, their heads tilted, then quickly grasped the strategy, their small green hands moving the stones with a deadly seriousness that made him smile. In return, they taught him a Vidian song, a simple, repetitive melody about the moon's journey across the copper sky. Their high, clear voices weaving together in the firelight was a sound he hadn't known he needed. It was a piece of their world they were giving him, and it felt like a gift more valuable than any piece of tech from the shuttle. The nights were the true test. Era's sleep was often broken. She would wake with a gasp, her small body rigid with a terror she couldn't voice. The cage, the fire pits, the smell of the skriak, they lived on in the dark behind her eyes. He started sleeping closer to them, his bedroll just a hand's breadth from theirs. When the nightmares came, he wouldn't speak. He would just reach out and place his hand on her small back, a steady, solid weight in the darkness. He would feel the tight muscles slowly relax under his palm, her breathing ease back into the rhythm of sleep. His presence was an anchor. It was a quiet promise that the dark held no monsters that could reach her here. Nima watched this. She saw how her sister's fears receded under his quiet guardianship. Her own courage, always a fierce, brittle thing, began to change. It grew less desperate, more steady. It found a mirror in his own. His calm in the face of danger was no longer just a soldier's training. It was a choice to be the stable ground they could stand on. Her bravery was a choice to meet the world head-on, to protect what was hers. They were teaching each other what strength could look like. This unit they had formed was not built on blood or shared history. It was a structure built plank by plank from shared survival, from choices made in the ashes and the dark. It was a family forged in the heat of necessity and cooled into something permanent. He realized, watching them sing their moon song, that this was the answer to Captain Reeves's final plea. This was what it meant to not lose your humanity. It was not about holding on to some abstract ideal. It was about the physical reality of a child's hand finding yours in the middle of the night. It was not about flags or planets or oaths sworn to a distant command. It was about the simple, profound act of holding a hand in the dark. The unexpected alliance, born from a single choice in a burning field, no longer felt like a chance occurrence. Looking at them now, it felt like the only thing that could have ever happened. It felt inevitable. The day arrived with the low, constant hum of the shuttle's engines. The sound was a vibration through the stone of the plateau, a reminder that the clock had run out. The 3-day grace period was over. Maxim stood with Nima on one side and Era on the other. The entire Vidian southern tribe stood behind them, a silent, green-skinned wall of solidarity. Their presence was not a threat. It was a statement. He was not alone. The rising copper sun warmed the back of his neck. High above, a pair of azure birds circled on the thermal currents, their cries faint and distant. The air smelled of clean stone and the faint, sweet scent of the forest below. It was a beautiful morning on a world he had learned to call home. The stark gray shuttle looked out of place against it, a machine from a different reality. Captain Rivera stood at the base of the shuttle's ramp. Her posture was rigid, her hands clasped behind her back. Her expression was carefully neutral, a professional mask that gave nothing away. She was waiting for his decision. Her crew stood by, ready to either welcome him aboard or seal the hatch and leave. The moment hung in the air, heavy and still. His choice was already made. He had known it since he turned his back on the ship days before. He would not be getting on that shuttle. He would not be returning to Earth, not today. But the finality of that decision had shifted over the last 3 days. The shape of his refusal was still forming in his mind. It was not a simple rejection. It was a redirection. Earth was not entirely lost to him. It was a part of who he was. His training, his language, his history, they were threads woven into his being. He could not cut them, and he did not want to. The vision circle had shown him that. It had reframed the dilemma. The path was not about choosing one world and denying the other. It was about finding a way to honor both, to let the soldier and the guardian exist in the same man. He looked away from the captain, away from the ship. His gaze traveled across the plateau, over the heads of the tribe and out toward the horizon. The land stretched away in folds of deep green and copper rock, endless and unknown. It was a world of possible futures, not a trap. It held danger, yes, but it also held a place for him, a purpose, a family. The horizon was not a boundary. It was an invitation, 2 worlds, 1 heart. The phrase Nima and Era had given him was no longer a child's simple rhyme. It was his new reality. His identity was no longer a singular point. It had stretched, become something wider, more complex. He contained the star maps of Earth and the songlines of Zaya. This moment was not an ending. It was a beginning. The start of a different kind of mission, one with no manual, no extraction point, and a definition of success he would have to write for himself. He did not look back at the shuttle. He did not offer Captain Rivera an explanation or a negotiation. Explanations were for people who owed them. He owed his explanation to the 2 small hands holding his. He felt Nima's grip tighten. He felt Era lean against his leg. He took a slow, deep breath, filling his lungs with the air of this world. Then he stepped forward. Not toward the ship, not toward the unknown horizon alone. He stepped forward on the path that led away from the plateau, back toward the forest, back toward the life he had built. He stepped forward beside his family. Their small steps matched his. The tribe moved with them, a quiet, living wave following his lead. He left the hum of the engines behind, walking into the warmth of the copper sun. A man finally going home. Survival is measured by more than breath. Maxim learned this in the ashes of a settlement with a child's hand in his. True survival is connection. It's the bond that forms when you stand beside someone who has nothing, and you choose to stay. Humanity isn't found in safe choices. It's found in the impossible ones. It's a soldier refusing to abandon 2 children to the dark. The greatest courage begins with a single decision that defies all logic. It starts when you turn away from safety and choose to face the unknown with someone else.